want to use this opportunity to, as I said, to kind of push our thinking about what is analogies, and are there other forms of relational thinking that also merit our consideration? And that's why I talk about why dissimilarities matter. I should say that I chose this particular slide picture because I very much like chiaroscuro, and I also like to say the word. It brings back my Italian roots, but it's all about the critical playing of light against dark, and how it is that sharpness of those contrasts give a picture its crispness, its image comes out from that interplay. And that is an analogy for what I am going to be talking about today as well. So let me go ahead and see if I can get this thing to move forward. There we go. So I have several goals. One of them is I began my work in the late 1970s and early 80s, very much being fascinated by analogical reasoning and its role in children's understanding and literacy development. I'm going to overview some of that early work and what it contributed to my understanding. And then I want to take a moment to try to justify this expanded view of relational reasoning. Why do we need something other than analogy? And for those of us who are deeply committed to analogical reasoning, it almost seems heretical, but we'll see. And then I want to describe the various ways that we've gone about trying to assess whether or not these forms exist, how they operate in isolation, but mostly, as you're going to see in complex problem solving, kind of how they play off of one another in some sort of orchestrated way. And then what we've learned from all of this to date, leaving time for us to talk about, of course, where do we go from here? Because I want to learn from you as much as possible as well. And that's what the beauty of a seminar is. It's my chance to share my thinking, but also to learn from the stellar students and faculty. Like Deidre, I saw her face and flash across the screen. People like that can teach me a great deal as well. So I'm going to talk about in the beginning, kind of an auspicious title, but when I started out, I was particularly fascinated with several aspects of analogical reasoning. One of them was, at the time, there were individuals like Deidre who were kind of looking at a Piagetian notion about, can young children reason analogically? Should they be able to, given their cognitive level of development? And I spent a lot of early time testing out the notion about, can young children reason analogically? And around that, also developing ways to watch how that changes over the course of time as a result of a number of factors, not the least of which is increased knowledge, increased opportunities to use the thinking and language of analogical reasoning. Then I've also engaged, because I do have roots in classrooms and schools, and a very practical as well as a theoretical interest in reasoning analogically at that time. I really wanted to know, how do we, or can we, I should say, first of all, can we train the underlying processes of analogic reasoning within the context of classrooms and nested in content domains, using content like science and social studies as a way to help students use the component processes underlying analogic reasoning and to see what effect that would have. I also went through a period of time where my goal was to try to educate teachers about the power of analogic reasoning and how it could be utilized to help them teach children to think more deeply, to understand things at a deep structure level rather than just superficially. And all of that went fairly well, I should say. I haven't done much training as of late for multiple reasons, I think. But it's something I, as you're going to see me say, I'd like to have my students get involved in, if not me directly. And then there's also some theoretical reason for looking at analogic reasoning at that time, because I was really fascinated with transfer, or I should say the lack of transfer in what I saw. And I wanted to see if I could use and apply the processes of analogic reasoning to actually promote transfer. So theoretically, and then doing some practical work in that area. In one study, we looked at different ways to train analogic reasoning and whether or not that had an effect, and whether that effect differed for individuals who had been identified within a school district as gifted versus non-gifted. Um, but there were multiple reasons I quote this study here in particular. One is because there's not a singular way one can convey analogic reasoning to somebody if you're training them, but there seems to be some need for explication, for being a bit more direct, and that's what this particular study indicated. And during this period of time, I started on a path that I still pursue now, and that is spending time trying to create tasks or tests or measures that allow me to unearth what's going on inside children's or adolescents or even adults' minds. And the test of analogic reasoning, or we called it the TARC at that point, that was created with Stephen White, who's now retired. Can I just tell you, it's scary when your students are retiring. But anyway, that this test allowed us to create a context where children could display analogic reasoning because it was a game playing task. It was something that was physical. And it used attribute blocks that were very common in preschools. And so it was using materials they understood in a context that really promoted them being kind of open and challenging, because in a game playing context, and they were told that as a person playing the game with them, I was going to try to fool them or try to trick them. And so they were to be on the alert, and if they didn't agree, they were supposed to argue. And we did get a lot of pushback from these very young children who thought that was part of the game and were comfortable in speaking their mind. But I have since done a lot with task development, as you're going to see later. The other thing that started in that period, and it's something that I still promote now, and I promote it not just when I'm talking about analogical reasoning, but other forms of cognitive processes, is that, or even I would say domain specific, is that I think sometimes I was floored by, and I still am, this idea that all error is noise, that one either has a correct response on measures, including measures of analogical reasoning, or the rest of it is just throwaway. It's error in a broad sense. And I began with my colleagues to develop graduated response options whenever there was an opportunity to do so, or to create rubrics with graduated scoring, so we could understand that some not perfect analogic responses or responses to an analogic measure, domain specific or general, really conveyed more understanding than others. And this idea that we throw away these kind of graduated possibilities, and we fail to notice what is known by the person responding, because we're treating all less than perfect correct answers as noise. And this is something I would urge you all to think about broadly, and not just in terms of analogic reasoning. So that was kind of where I spent my time. And it's not that I stopped doing this entirely. It's still very much a part of who I am. But what happened over time is that as with many of us who have long histories, is you push the envelope a different way. You ask questions that lead you in directions that perhaps when you started out you did not intend. And so that the question I'm asked now very often is, why do we need more than analogies? Analogies are beautiful tools. They're tools that we use not just in terms of understanding an individual's ability to uncover the deep structure that might exist, but in my presentations, in my writing, my ability to think analogically is what makes my writing so much easier for me. I tend to be a Gestalt thinker broadly, and this ability to kind of see an overlying structure for things allows me to move forward. But that being said, even though I am a great admirer of analogic reasoning and will always be, there was something that troubled me, and it goes back to this notion of chiaroscuro. And that is, just like we treat error and all the same as noise when we're doing assessments, I think we fail to see that even though analogies may be the figure that we're looking at, that sometimes the ground that's in a picture, in a problem, in a puzzle, has an importance to it that we overlook. And I wanted to understand, going back to the early literature, and I think this quote by William James, who's one of my favorites in the studies of what I do. I'll give you a second to read it, if you will. I don't need to read it aloud for you. I think anytime we're engaging in reasoning that has some depth to it, we're not thinking only in one direction. We're not only looking for those relations, those comparisons that are associative in nature, so we can see how this attribute matches to this one. Even as we do that, there is the underlying differences that must be recognized. Analogies are not perfection. They never will be. And we're not surprised to see that those who choose to try to push an analogy as far as they can ultimately run up against the fact that no analogy is perfect. And the more that you are trying to bring together very disparate sorts of things, the more that the failure for the attributes to hold will come into play. So there's always that give and take, that you kind of like always moving in a circle around similarities and differences, the likes and dislikes. But at some time, as I'm going to try to point out, the things that are dissimilar have a great deal of power, and we have not utilized that power to understand relational reasoning in a fuller sense. So what about this power of dissimilarity? Why do we need to think about the dissimilarity even as we promote analogical reasoning, let's say? And I think it goes back to what I just said. Dissimilarities arise because there's some need to see the contrast. You're not ever going to see the light without the dark. You're not going to see the similarities unless there was some sort of backdrop to that to begin with. And it's not always noise. It's not always something to be overlooked. And that's where I want to begin this kind of promotion of this broader view. And even sometimes, as I'm going to argue in a moment, the ground becomes the figure and the figure becomes the ground, because the dissimilarities have a particular power to them, a classification or categorization that we should not overlook. And in fact, some of these dissimilarities to be of use in relational reasoning, let me just put a side note here as I stop a moment. I sometimes make a difference between relational reasoning and relational thinking. And what I mean by that, without entering it into a whole different phase, is the fact that sometimes, even though I'm thinking at a Gestalt level, I'm seeing these disparate looking things in some sort of similar way. I'm not necessarily being as aware and engaged in the analysis process as I might be. It's almost like, after a while, a fairly instinctive habit of mind that I have. And so I use relational thinking to talk about the opportunity or the kind of conditions that arise when these similarities emerge for us among dissimilar objects or experiences or events, but not at a highly conscious or analytic level. And I think that's why I use relational thinking sometimes to capture that other side of what happens. But that being said, I do think there's times when you're being analytic about it, that you find that there's classifiable, categorical sort of dissimilarities that we could all benefit from understanding better, and maybe ultimately, as we'll talk about, training and teaching better than we do. And when I started being captivated by dissimilarities, I was working with one of my former students who's brilliant. She's a full professor in statistics and measurement at Penn State. And we were arguing over the idea of these dissimilarities, and we were reading philosophy, we were reading theoretical mathematics, we were reading into scientific reasoning to kind of get a handle on, is there a way to understand these dissimilarities in a better fashion? And from that, it took about a year to get to this point. Let me just say, it doesn't emerge instantaneously. You really have to throw yourself into reading some philosophy of mathematics, for example, and that sort of thing to really better understand this phenomenon. And so that after about a year, in addition to analogy, we came up with anomalies, antinomies, and antitheses. And it's interesting because it's not that I sought all A's, but I love the fact that they're all A's. I love alliterations to begin with. So that what we did at that point in time is trying to explain these things is to really realize that each of these has a certain sort of critical nature to them that is valued and actually appears in the research if you know where you're looking for them. So what do these forms entail? And so let me put them back up. Anomalies were something that I would be running into quite frequently in reading of science research, of understanding like anomalies in sort of data streams and what the anomalies meant, and were they meaningful anomalies or were they just a particular one-off sort of situation? So there's a lot of the use of anomalies, particularly in mathematics, in science literature. And what you're doing with an anomaly, of course, is and we do it all the time as researchers. We're constantly looking, and when we're cleaning our data sets, we're looking to see whether or not there's something that stands out within the data. Now, let me start out by saying that in all these cases, you're dealing with a set of information, a set of data, or sets of data that you're given, or that emerge. And so that when you're cleaning your data set, you really know that you're in a set that has some sort of bounds to them that belong together in some sort of way. But there's these cases that pop out at you that are just not typical, right? And the question then as researchers is we look at those outliers to see if they're meaningful outliers. Do they represent something that's missed in the data and that needs to be thought about and for our designs to be adjusted? So there is a history of anomalies. And of the two, analogies and anomalies are the two that most people are at least cursorily aware of. Analogies are something that we hear that most students have heard about. Some of them have even been taught something about analogies or analogical reasoning. And anomalies are something that's comfortable with them. The next two are far less common in the educational or psychological experiences that I've come across. I came across antinomous reasoning because I was really bothered. I'm going to put both these up and I'm going to explain to you. I'm going to come back to this at the end when I talk about where do we go from here. In the case of antinomous and antithetical reasoning, people often deal with these things as a clump. They put them together in the way that they think about and talk about the world. But if you know Bertrand Russell and you know about paradox, and you understand that there's a point at which there are true ontological categories that exist, not very often in the social sciences, I would say, but they do exist where something is either A or it's B. It can fit only set A or set B. The boundaries between those two categories are well defined, and there's no bleeding between them. And that's very important to think about. So antinomous reasoning is when we make choices or we have to look at things broadly and find whether they belong to a given set or the alternative set. But that is very different than antithetical reasoning. In antithetical reasoning, we have opposing positions. And as we do with Hegelian philosophy, there's this idea that there's a multitude of positions between those points, right? there's a continuum that exists. And what we try to do is we make judgments as whether or not some events seem to sit more to the one side of the continuum or the other. So it's really a relative contrast that's being made. And in social science, we may use words like higher, lower. This is a good teacher, a bad teacher. This is a good student. This is a student with special needs. But there's no purity of that category or that classification as there is when we're talking about something that's truly binary. And I want you to think about that, because one of the arguments I'm going to make to you is these two are the hardest ones for people sometimes to get. And it's not because there's anything wrong with them cognitively. It's because the way in which they're taught is these two things are immersed together and mushed together in such a way. And it's sometimes the words of one are used to describe the other. And that's very difficult in terms of clarity. Okay. Now, what have we done? Once I had these, my work always starts out at some theoretical level. But how do we take what's theory, what's a theoretical notion, and actually test it out? Well, we've tested it in a number of ways. And I think this is important, not just one way, not just a singular sort of path. But we've done things like we started out, because again, remember, my history is linguistics and language and literacy, a lot of discourse analysis. So what we would do is we would get very rich cases of verbal interchange, sometimes between a teacher and student, sometimes between somebody who's a relative expert in a field versus someone who is not quite at their same stage. We look at the way they engage in some sort of complex problem solving. And I give credit to a colleague, Kevin Dunbar. I know Lindsay is here, and he's a person who understood the dynamics of this group problem solving and what it can give away or reveal. And I appreciate his willingness to share some of his data and insights with us in the early stages of our thinking through some of this. But the discourse analysis is rich. We have tapes of classrooms, so we can look at it in a sense in much more in vivo than in vitro. And by that I mean, I don't necessarily want to move immediately to these highly manipulated sort of places to examine what I'm trying to test here in terms of these multiple forms. I really want to sometimes look at it as it exists in nature, how it operates in a kind of uncontextualized, orchestrated environment before I move into more structured. And that doesn't mean I don't want to do things like neurological studies of these forces. It's just that for me, it usually starts out in a much more holistic, naturalistic way. And I said to you, I've spent a lot of time, my students and I should say, or my colleagues and I have spent a lot of time trying to create measures. Because if you want to study four forms, there's not a measure out there to do that. So we've had to create for ourselves a number of tools, and I'm very pleased with the ones we've come up with so far. And my goal is, I've been approached about selling these things, putting them out to be used and to make money. I'm not doing any of this for money because I'm comfortable. Let's be honest. If I needed money, I probably would. But anyway. But these are all available for use by other researchers, provided they follow whatever the guidelines are around these, because they are protected measures. The power of some of them, as you're going to see in a moment, I'm going to explain each of them briefly, is that you lose the power of them when they become practiced or overly familiar, which is something we'll talk about, I'm sure. So the first one that we really spent about 3 years developing it to the point where we were pleased enough with it to validate it and to standardize it and create all sorts of normings around it, was the test of relational reasoning, which does test out the four forms. These are just two of the release items. These are the practice items that people take at the beginning so that they can be sure that they understand the directions. Because a lot of these are extremely novel kind of ways of thinking about the world. You've got to give them, we give them two practice items. We don't train them, We just let them know what the correct answer was if they got it wrong. We don't say why they got it wrong. Because again, the point here is to see what they can do, not to teach them how to do. And these are our fluid measures. I do like to start out with fluid measures because, as you know, if you want to test a wide swath of the population who around the world, even you've got to be careful about the degree to which these things are crystallized in form, the degree to which they rely on what you have been taught as content. I'll give you a chance to see these. You can probably picture out what they are. The one on the, I don't know right and left very well, but the one on the right is an example of the antithesis sample item. Whereas the first one, of course, is very much like a Raven sort of like item that comes from to test the analogies. These tests all consist of 32 items. All the measures I'm going to show you have a consistency of structure in that sort of way. And all four forms are tested. Now, there's also the test of relational reasoning junior, which has gotten a lot of use as of late. There are norms for it. It has been standardized, but it has to be standardized into two age groups because there seems to be some sort of shift that occurs probably about fourth or fifth grade, depending on the country that you're in. But it's very similar. It's got 4 scales. Each scale consists of 8 items. So all of these measures have 32 items, 8 items per scale. These are the 2 fluid. And I know you're jotting down questions and all, and please do that. And it's just that if I don't get all this out while it's in my mouth and in my head, then I'll lose trains of thought. Here we go. The next one we developed, we wanted to see whether or not these processes of reasoning relationally came to vary if we moved it to more crystallized. So we moved to a verbal, we next created a verbal test of relational reasoning. And I'll let you read those and see if you can, I'll give you a second. Does anybody want to venture one with the animals? What you think it is? I don't know if you have mics on or off. So what kind of relational thinking does it entail? What do you think is the correct answer? We don't take off if you're wrong, so don't worry about it. Marguerite, if your mic is on, you can try. Margarita.
I think it's analogy, and I think the sentence that doesn't, I speak English as a foreign language, so I'm not sure about the way you refer to groups of animals, but I think it's D. I would guess that it's.
And which one are you doing? The one about, I can hardly hear you. I'm sorry. It's the sound.
I'm doing the one where it says 3 of the sentences follow a particular pattern or rule.
Okay. And the deciding factor for you was what? I mean, how did you define the answer? Not just what was the answer?
So it's about animals that are carnivorous and they eat on a prey in a way that using the manner in which they eat on that prey is with some
nobody wants to be devoured, feasted upon, or gobbled. Right. I don't think. Yeah. So that's right. So this herd of buffalo are munching on grass. It's the carnivorous. Right. Oh God.
Herbivorous.
Yeah, no, they're not omnivorous. Oh, never mind. Anyway, this is where my processing gets lost. But you're right, absolutely. So this is a case of looking for something that's a kind of anomalous pattern. I won't make you read the other ones, but what you really have to do there is find something that fits only one of those paragraphs and not the other. Much more of a categorical decision, not something that can fit both or either. These are not easy to construct, again, because language is very hard to play with and all the subtleties of language that exist. But thank you, Margarita, for doing that for being my victim. And more recently, my student, uh, Hongyang Zhang, has also urged us to create a relational reasoning with words. It's only words that are involved. It's not connected discourse, which makes it a bit easier for some individuals. But this is also a very hard sort of test to process. But here you can see that what you, very similar to the passage on the prior slide, where you had to find a sentence that could fit only one of those two paragraphs, but didn't belong to both or neither. The same thing holds here, but it's with singular words. And there's and what's interesting about this, and her argument was, and her data for her dissertation held up quite beautifully, is that to really understand words, you have to know them more than just at a superficial sort of level. You have to understand the subtleties of what these words mean compared to others. And it was very interesting as we went through as the lab did for quite some period of time, playing with these words, is the degree to which you think you know a meaning of a word, but the coloring of it, the subtlety of it, really shifts your ability to think and reason with them in this sort of way. Okay. So in addition to these more fluid and crystallized measures, we've done both longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. Our longitudinal studies have really taken, in one case, we're using data that had been collected for some period of time in New Zealand. I think it was 3 years over time. I would like to find a way to find the money to create our own kind of longitudinal database and some sort of way to watch development unfold across these various forms and types. That's one of my goals, but we have looked both cross-sectionally and longitudinally. And we've looked at children, we've looked at adolescents, young children, we looked at adolescents, we looked at young adults, and in a more recent study, which I'll mention, we've also looked at senior citizens that represented a very unique group. We've also looked across any number of different domains and disciplines. I like the way that domains and disciplines give color to things differently. And I want to understand how these processes unfold, if they unfold the same or iterate, they're more likely iterate. That is, they change, but not so dramatically that they're not identifiable for what they are in these different domains and disciplines. And as to date, these are just the studies that we know have been conducted. As I said, I make these measures available to individuals to use wherever and for whatever purposes they wish. And to date, these are the countries where studies have been conducted. We've been involved in some of these, but not all of them directly. Okay. All right. So what have we learned from all of these studies of these multiple forms? I'm going to just go through the points, and then I'm going to pull up some charts and tables to kind of illustrate some of these points in a bit more detail. The first one is, regardless of age, regardless of the nationality, of gender, and of the disciplines, we find all four forms are present to some extent in some way. They're present, they can be documented. As I'll talk about in a moment, however, their centrality varies for a number of reasons. Which one it becomes more important, when it becomes more important, when it's more typical of the population, is what really becomes the points of greater difference that we have to think about. There are also, let me go back to this. One of these studies that I'm not going to mention in some detail, but I want to bring it up here because two of the individuals involved in it are in the audience. And that is that we looked at the way teachers teach in science and math classes. And we looked to see whether or not their instructions, the way they effectively or more or less effectively deliver instruction, takes into account these types of reasoning forms. We tend to find that, not surprisingly, I should say surprisingly, but it's not, that teachers don't know the language of relational reasoning themselves. And if you don't know the language of relational reasoning, as Vygotsky would say, the word is a doorway into a deeper understanding. If you don't know the language of it, it's less likely that you present it in a way that's clear and precise. And we find, for example, that the use of antinomy and antithesis, as I mentioned to you earlier, gets very fuzzy. It's very, particularly in non-science or classrooms. And that is because, in part, the kind of questions that teachers pose, the kind of goals that they set are often set around things like, let's compare and contrast. Now, compare and contrast is a mainstay in terms of getting students of all ages, my college students being among them, to probe more deeply. But they don't make a distinction in this compare contrast. They don't use the chiaroscuro sort of notion to highlight or to sharpen the images of what's similar and what's dissimilar. We've also looked at patterns in the longitudinal data in particular, and I'm going to share some of that with you. There's some things worth noting in what we found. Whether or not it would hold in studies by others remains to be seen. And for those of us who hold dearly to analogies, they still seem to be a gateway process. It seems like you need to almost start both developmentally and maybe cognitively to first kind of apprehend something about the two that pull them together, these two objects or events or whatever, before you can go anywhere deeper. So, and we'll find, I'll show you some data that points to this, what I'm calling the gateway sort of notion. And then antithesis and antinomy are two extremely challenging forms. And I understand partly why, but we'll talk about those a bit more and why that's the case. And conversely, of course, that means that you have analogy and anomaly as being two that are much more that students can deal with, or individuals can deal with much more readily, and can swallow and operate on very readily. One of the most surprising findings we've had is in all the studies when we use relational reasoning as one of our baseline measures, it becomes a better predictor of outcomes than some of the more domain-specific measures that we use. And one of our former students used this relational reasoning measure in his high school. He runs all the academic programs for a very well-known parochial school in Washington, D.C. And the degree to which relational reasoning better predicted the students who would perform well in the classes over the years was really quite amazing. There's something about it, as with any kind of fundamental cognitive ability, that really allows one to utilize the information around them, to harness the power of information in a way that might get lost otherwise. My dissertation was all about analogic reasoning back in the dark ages, when you still, we punched cards and we still typed on typewriters. But there it was this idea that I could see parallels between the individuals who were good at reading comprehension and those who were good in performing analogic reasoning via the ravens. And I still know that there's power there in relational reasoning, whether I'm talking about analogy or these other forms as well. And then this is the other lesson I would present to you all as points of thought, because it's going to come up in a moment. And that is, these things do not operate in isolation. We may test them that way. In some ways, we needed to verify that these four forms exist. Then we move it from theory into something that's much more practical. But in truth, whenever you're confronted with complex problems, just like James indicated, and other people like Spearman and others, and I think Bob Sternberg would say it too, that these things work in conjunction. It's a dance of these forms. Whenever you're involved in something that requires you to think deeply and to make very fine-tuned sort of decisions. So here's some data to point out what I was saying. This is a study, this is one of them that involved Kevin Dunbar, where we looked at an expert and a resident and attending physician during the process of making diagnosis about a patient's condition and then deciding on treatment that would be workable. And what's fascinating about this is that it was the first time we really came to this realization about the fact that these forms play off of one another. And they play off one another in a way that fits the task of the problem at hand. So in this case, when you're trying to, when residents are presenting cases, that the first thing they spend time doing is offering information about what about this patient's history is an anomaly, right? What about their all the medical data that they have available to them point that this is something that's there's aberrance here of some sort, and they share those. They begin to kind of punctuate and populate the discussion with these references to anomalies in the case. But then sometimes you'll see that periodically the darker figures are the attending. The attending, like a very effective teacher, is part of this decision-making group. But what he did is he would sit outside of it and kind of punctuate at times to get the students to think about something else or to rethink what they were doing. And so when after these kind of anomalous conditions were noted, somebody would tend to venture that this reminds them of a case of X. And as that's where they get to making this kind of analogic comparison. But then sometimes in the case you see here, it worked in the opposite, but sometimes what the attending would do then is say, but have you thought about this? And in a Socratic sort of way would throw into the mix something that would throw that out as a possible case of X, that there was something critical that was missing in the case. And so they would go back through the process as well. And I think you're going to see this again in just a moment, that I think this is what we really want to understand, how these similarities and differences, the kinds of similarities and differences become more or less figure ground, become far more important. For doctors, if you know much about doctors and their reasoning, most of them are case-based reasoners, which means they're looking for something that's analogous. They're looking for these symptoms to configure in such a way it configures to a representation of a certain kind of illness. But they're not always perfect, and it requires them to be deep thinkers in multiple ways as well. Let me go to one more. I'm going to go to this one, and then I'll go back to the others. This was a more recent study done by Sophie Jablonski, where she studied senior engineering students who were working collaboratively on designing in mechanical engineering, designing a task of some sort, something that would solve a given problem that existed. And what you find similarly, this is one of her patterns. She looked at who's talking, when these things came up, and she combined them with collaborative metacognitive sort of processes where somebody would say, I think we need to better understand this, and it would send the process back. And you don't need to understand all of this. I think the dark diamonds, the dark orange things are cases of antithetical reasoning, and the lighter orange are analogic. But and other ones, she looked at the other processes that came in. But I think we need to understand more about how reasoning operates in this sort of, I don't know, orchestrated manner that gets us to where we need to go. And this is some of the longitudinal data, and Sophie and the rest of us looked at data that was gathered, as I said, for some period of time in New Zealand as a country for, I think it was 2 or 3 years. And I want you to notice this, but I want to point out something to you. What this shows you is that among younger children, now it was from pre-K all the way to 12th grade. So the early grades are, I think, are grades pre-K through 2. The middle grades are like 3 to 5, and then the older students. But what you find is that younger students really have to rely much more, as I said to you before, much more on analogic reasoning and somewhat on anomalous reasoning. And what they were doing in this problem, by the way, I should give you that, is they were there. It's a whole program of study in New Zealand on technological literacy. But that they mean like tools as well. They're not talking about technology being only computers. They're really talking about objects that are technologies that we use in life. Some of the technology was familiar, some was very somewhat, some were very novel. And what you find is that when the when the material was somewhat familiar, that you could see that the younger kids could manage. They could manage mostly with analogies and anomalies. When the problem became unfamiliar, they couldn't function without teacher scaffolding and support. Whoever was there helping them learn and understand needed to support them more. Now you look at the older students and it looks like they don't use analogies at all. But the truth is, these are familiar, more familiar problems to them. And I think this is something for us to keep in mind because the need for complexity is at issue. We don't need to be analogical reasoners always when the problems in front of us are highly familiar. We can shift more to analogic or anomalous thinking rather than reasoning. But it does show that there's a pattern which came in earlier and later. This is a study that we did. It's for a special issue, I think that Lindsay's working on. And what we're doing here and what we wanted to do is we had an opportunity in South Korea to look at adults, and I don't mean young adults. These are people in their 50s, mostly 60s, 70s, who are only now what's listed there as atypical students. They're only now getting middle school and high school education because of the Korean War. Korea was an extremely poor country at one point, and these people stayed in fields or they stayed home and they didn't get their education in. But South Korea is committed to 100% educated populace. And so now they've created programs where they're bringing back these senior citizens and allowing them to experience middle school and high school now. That's a big difference. And we wanted to understand what that difference meant in terms of their reasoning ability. And here's more of what I mean when I think of analogies as a kind of gateway process. Even those who are only now getting fully educated as adults, senior citizens, they could still function fairly well with analogies. But when you get into things like antithesis and anomalies, antithesis and antithetical reasoning, that what you find is these people who are not educated, formally educated, were really struggling. And trying to understand what it is that contributes to our reasoning. I know some of you have written about this. It really has to do somewhat with your knowledge. Reasoning about something, you need to have some understanding of that thing in order for you to reason deeply about it. And that's, I think, partly what happens here. I think the other thing schools give us, because they don't give us much explicit training in relational reasoning, is they give us opportunities to use the language of relational reasoning when we're problem solving, when we're working through curriculum in some sort of way. And so, but I find this to be fascinating data. I find this ability to look at a really aberrant group, an anomalous group in this way, a chance for us to explore some sort of aspects of what goes on typically versus atypically that may lead us to understand relational reasoning more, or thinking or cognitive processes more, whatever it is we want to study. Okay. Let me kind of pull it together and just to say some of the things that I've been thinking about of where to go with this. We've been studying relational reasoning now for at least 8 years, it's maybe even approaching a decade when I was doing the theoretical work about it. But the question is, what do we want to do with this? What do we want to know more about? And maybe some of you will be the people who will help us to uncover some of all this. So let me just put out a few points to you. And then I'm going to use the time, because I'm here to learn from you as well, to see what you can deal with. What I am struggling with right now in a more theoretical level, and I want to say this is theoretical, is I am trying to understand why antithetical and antinomous reasoning are a struggle for us to understand. And then I've been observing, because I love teaching. I love to teach both undergraduates and as well as doctoral students. But one of the things I notice in the instruction I see around my university, that I remember seeing in middle school, and then I also think I see a lot of in everyday life right now, is we take things that are by no means true dichotomies and we classify them, we talk about them, we treat them that way. Even right now in political rhetoric, somebody's a liberal or they're conservative, they're blue state, they're red state, they're, they're good, they're evil, everything gets put in these boxes that and talked about as if they are truly ontological categories, which they are not. None of these things are. They bleed all over the place, because there's no way one can make a pure distinction between the categories that I hear teachers use all the time when they'll say, this is the right way, this is the wrong way to do it. This is truth, if you will, from an epistemic sort of standpoint, or it's not. And I think we've only begun to understand the consequences of that way of thinking. And I want us to be careful about false dichotomies as teachers, as thinkers ourselves, and what we can do about it. Whether or not it'll change the face of relational reasoning over time, I don't know, but I am concerned about its presence and the ramifications of those. And that's theoretical, where I am theoretically at the moment. We also have done very little training in all four forms of relational reasoning. Training was something I did a lot of with analogies in the early years. And one of my former students, who's a professor right now in Illinois, is Courtney Haddon. And she was very interested in working with rural students in a high poverty area. And she was interested in working with them because they struggled to make sense of texts that they were given, because they found nothing about themselves in the text. There was no hook that they could use between themselves and the contents of those texts. And she used the four forms to teach them how to not be so concerned only with finding similarities between their experiences, their lives, their understanding, which is a very common literacy practice, and what is being talked about in the text. She had them use the dissimilarity forms as a way to really probe deeply about what's crazy related to the way I understand the world, what would never work in my home environment, my situation. And by opening the door that way, these students showed massive gains by being trained in the four forms over and above other forms of literacy training that would allow them to use background knowledge in a way to help comprehension. And she went back a couple months later and found that the relational reasoning training was as effective as it was all those months before, over and above the other forms of training. What that means is it's a one-off case at this point, but I know we can do something for students by training them embedded within subject matter areas. I think is very important. And I want to do more of this complex problem solving processes, and we've got manuals created to try to understand how the discourse and dialogue work in science classes, in math classrooms, in engineering problem solving, and with experts. And that's a rich way to understand this orchestration, this kind of rhythm and pattern of the four forms. The one thing I have not been able to do, and I haven't gotten my colleagues here at Maryland to jump on board with me about it, is I really want to understand. Right now, I can talk to you about the differences theoretically. I can talk to you about the differences in the assessments. I don't know how it neurologically differentiates, or if they do. Does analogy and these other forms look the same when you do fMRIs or whatever else? I really want to know, is there a neurological difference that comes into play? And I still am fascinated by the lack of transfer as it occurs. And I want to know whether or not training the relational reasoning, going deeper into the four forms, maybe can promote greater transfer. I'm using a lot of the kind of language of RR and all of that in the undergraduate classes that I teach. And some of my students who also teach these courses are in the audience. And we find that students fail to make linkages. They fail to build these bridges between things they're learning. There's almost like a natural tendency in education to think of the subjects you're being taught on day one as something different from the stuff you're taught on day two, or the things you hear about in my learning how to learn course, and my learning course is different than something you're learning in your disciplinary areas. And yet, if you get them to think about linkages, both similarities and sharp contrast, we're finding that it seems to help them understand better how all of this is connected in some sort of meaningful way. Okay, and finally, as I said to you, I would love to get the beginnings of a longitudinal database, something where I can track students using both, I think, both the fluid and maybe some of the crystallized measures, in ways to understand how all schooling and the exposure and all that really begins to change the patterns that we see in the way they think. That's my spiel. I'm going to stop sharing or I'm going to at least, yeah, I'm going to stop sharing for now, I think, and then just allow you all to hit me with your ideas. And Deidre, it's a pleasure to see you